The letter crumpled in Grace Zimmerman's trembling hands as the stagecoach rattled over the uneven terrain of Wyoming Territory, 1875. The promise of a new life, a fresh start with a husband she'd never met, suddenly felt like a gamble she couldn't afford to lose. She smoothed the wrinkled paper, reading once more the words that had brought her across the country. Seeking bride of good character and sturdy constitution will provide comfortable home and respectable life. What Thomas Xavier didn't know was that she was arriving with nothing but 3 dresses, a tattered Bible, and $7 to her name. The stagecoach lurched to a stop outside Pine Ridge, a dusty frontier town that seemed to have sprouted directly from the earth. Wooden buildings lined the single main street, their facades weathered by sun and wind. Men in worn hats and leather boots ambled along the boardwalks, while horses stood hitched to posts, swishing their tails against persistent flies. Last stop, Pine Ridge. The driver called, jumping down to help with luggage. Grace gathered her single carpet bag, heart pounding. This was nothing like Philadelphia, where she'd worked as a seamstress until the factory closed. After losing her parents to influenza last winter, she had nothing left but debts and painful memories. The advertisement in the newspaper had seemed like divine intervention. Miss Zimmerman. A tall man approached as she stepped down from the coach. His face was partially shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat, but she could see a strong jaw dusted with stubble. "I'm Sheriff Parker. Mr. Xavier asked me to escort you to his ranch." Grace's stomach knotted with anxiety. "He didn't come himself." The sheriff looked uncomfortable. "He's preparing for your arrival, madam. It's about 10 miles out of town." They rode in the sheriff's wagon through rolling grasslands dotted with sagebrush. Mountains loomed in the distance, their peaks still carrying patches of snow despite the June heat. "What kind of man is Mr. Xavier?" Grace asked, breaking the silence. "Thomas, he's a good sort, quiet, hardworking, built his ranch from nothing after coming out here 8 years ago." He paused. "Lost his parents in the war, been on his own since he was 16. Grace nodded, recognizing a kindred spirit in this unseen man. Perhaps they would understand each other's loneliness. The ranch appeared on the horizon, a modest but well-maintained homestead with a 2-story house, a large barn, and several corrals where horses grazed. A windmill turned lazily in the afternoon breeze. A tall man stepped out onto the porch as they approached. Thomas Xavier cut an imposing figure broad-shouldered in a simple white shirt with the sleeves rolled up, revealing suntanned forearms. His brown hair was a touch too long, and his eyes were the color of the Wyoming sky. They fixed on Grace with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Miss Zimmerman," he said, coming forward to help her down from the wagon. His voice was deep but gentle, like distant thunder. His hands were calloused but careful as they encircled her waist, lifting her to the ground. "Mr. Xavier." She smoothed her travel-wrinkled dress, acutely aware of how plain she must look after 3 days on the road. "Call me Thomas, please." His eyes swept over her, taking in her simple blue dress, her chestnut hair pulled back in a practical bun, her one small bag. Sheriff Parker tipped his hat. "I'll leave you folks to get acquainted," he said, climbing back into his wagon. Alone with her prospective husband, Grace felt her courage falter. The advertisement had specified a woman of means to help establish a prosperous homestead. She had been deliberately vague in her response letter, focusing on her skills rather than her financial situation. "You must be tired from your journey," Thomas said, picking up her bag before she could protest. "Come inside." The house was surprisingly welcoming, simple but comfortable furniture, polished wood floors, curtains at the windows. He'd prepared for her arrival. "It's lovely," she said sincerely. "It's not much, but it's solid. I built most of it myself." Pride colored his voice. "Your room is upstairs." "I thought, until we're married, you'd want your privacy." Grace nodded, grateful for his consideration. "Mr. Xavier Thomas, there's something I should tell you before we proceed any further." He turned to her, one eyebrow raised. "Your advertisement mentioned a woman of means." She straightened her spine, determined to face his disappointment with dignity. "I'm afraid I misled you. I have skills. I'm an excellent seamstress. I can cook, clean, tend a garden, but I have no money. My parents died last winter, leaving only debts. I spent what little I had on the journey here." Thomas's expression grew still. He set her bag down slowly. "I understand if you wish to void our arrangement," she continued, her voice barely steady. "I can work in town until I earn enough for a ticket back east. You came all this way knowing you might be sent back?" he asked. Grace met his eyes. "I had nothing left in Philadelphia, and your letter, it seemed kind. I took a chance." Thomas walked to the window, looking out at his land. Silence stretched between them, taut as a wire. "A bride who would journey across the country with nothing but hope and courage," he finally said, still facing away from her. "Miss Zimmerman, gold don't buy what you bring," her heart stuttered. "I don't understand," he turned back to her. "I've saved enough to run this ranch for years. What I need isn't a woman's money, it's her heart, her determination. Anyone willing to risk what you have." He shook his head. "That's worth more than any dowry." Relief washed over Grace, followed quickly by confusion. "Then why did your advertisement specify means?" Thomas's face darkened. "It didn't, at least not as I wrote it." He pulled a folded newspaper from a shelf and handed it to her. The advertisement was indeed different from what she'd read. "The newspaper editor in town, he's an old friend who helped me word it. Seems he took liberties." Thomas ran a hand through his hair. "Carson thinks I need a wealthy wife. We've argued about it." Grace looked down at her worn boots. "I should have been honest from the start. I'm sorry. We've both been misled," Thomas said gently. "The question is, where do we go from here?" "That depends," Grace replied cautiously. "What kind of woman were you truly seeking?" Thomas moved to the kitchen table, pulling out a chair for her before sitting opposite. "Someone practical, hardworking, someone who understands that life out here isn't easy, but it's good." His eyes met hers. "Someone willing to build something lasting together." Grace sat down, heart beating faster. "That's what I want too, a fresh start, a place to belong." She hesitated. "But I don't want charity, I want to contribute." "This isn't charity," Thomas insisted. "Any woman who travels alone across the country, starting with nothing, that's someone I want by my side." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Besides, the house needs curtains that aren't made by a man with two left thumbs." Grace couldn't help smiling back. "I could certainly help with that." "Then we have an agreement." Thomas extended his hand across the table. "We'll take time to know one another, and if we suit, we'll marry. Your lack of fortune doesn't concern me." Grace placed her hand in his, noting how it disappeared in his grip. "We have an agreement." That night, after showing Grace to her room, Thomas sat on his porch watching the stars emerge. He hadn't expected to feel such an immediate connection to the woman he'd brought to his home. Her honesty, her quiet dignity in the face of possible rejection, these spoke more of her character than any letter could have conveyed. Upstairs, Grace unpacked her meager belongings, placing her mother's Bible on the bedside table. Through the open window came the nighttime sounds of the ranch horses nickering softly, the distant howl of a coyote, the whisper of wind through the tall grass. So different from Philadelphia's ceaseless noise, yet somehow already feeling like home. The next morning, Thomas was already working when Grace came downstairs at dawn. Through the window, she could see him mending a corral fence, his movements efficient and practiced. She found the kitchen well-stocked but disorganized, clearly the domain of a bachelor who cooked for necessity rather than pleasure. By the time he came in, she had breakfast waiting, fresh biscuits, eggs, and coffee that actually tasted like coffee rather than the bitter brew he'd offered her upon arrival. Thomas stopped in the doorway, surprise evident on his face. "You didn't need to do this." "I wanted to," Grace replied. "Consider it my way of earning my keep until we decide if we're suited." His expression softened. "You don't need to earn your keep, but I won't turn down a proper breakfast." He washed up at the basin by the door before joining her at the table. They ate in comfortable silence for a few minutes before Thomas spoke again. "I need to ride the north pasture today to check on some new calves. Would you like to come, see more of the ranch?" Grace hesitated. "I've never ridden a horse." "I have a gentle mare who would suit you." "But only if you're comfortable trying." The idea both terrified and exhilarated her. "Yes," she decided. "I'd like that." After breakfast, Thomas led her to the barn where he introduced her to a chestnut mare named Penny. "She's steady as they come," he assured her, showing Grace how to approach with confidence, how to let the horse sniff her hand before stroking her neck. "She's beautiful," Grace murmured, already enchanted by the mare's soft muzzle and intelligent eyes. Thomas demonstrated how to saddle and mount, then helped Grace up, his hands strong at her waist. The height was dizzying at first, but Penny stood patiently as Grace adjusted to the sensation. "Just relax," Thomas advised, mounting his own horse, a tall bay gelding. "Penny will follow my buck. Hold the reins lightly, she knows what to do." They set off at a walk, following a creek that wound through the property. Grace gradually relaxed, finding the rhythm of the horse's movement. Thomas rode slightly ahead, occasionally pointing out features of the land, the best grazing areas, a stand of cottonwoods where deer often sheltered, the distant line of mountains that marked the edge of his property. "How many acres do you have?" Grace asked, amazed by the vastness surrounding them. 640. "A full section." Pride colored his voice. "Started with a quarter section through the Homestead Act, bought the rest as I could afford it." "You've accomplished so much," Grace said, admiring not just the land but the man who had tamed it. Thomas shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. "It's a good piece of land, just needed someone willing to work it." They reached a rise overlooking a small valley where a stream meandered through lush grass. A dozen cows grazed peacefully, several with calves at their sides. "This is my favorite spot on the whole ranch," Thomas admitted as they dismounted. He spread a blanket under the shade of a lone oak tree, producing a canteen of water and some bread and cheese from his saddlebag. "Thought we might rest here a while." Grace sank gratefully onto the blanket, muscles unused to riding already protesting. The view was breathtaking, rolling grasslands stretching to distant mountains, the sky an endless blue canvas above. "It's beautiful," she said simply. "It can be harsh too," Thomas cautioned. "Winters are brutal. Summer brings drought sometimes. And there's always the threat of prairie fires, rustlers, or worse." "Nothing worth having comes without challenges," Grace replied. Thomas studied her face. "You're not what I expected, Grace Zimmerman. Is that good or bad?" "Good," he said decidedly. "Very good." Over the next 2 weeks, they fell into a comfortable routine. Grace took over the household management, bringing order to the chaos of Thomas's bachelor existence. She made curtains for the windows from fabric purchased in town, planted a proper vegetable garden, and organized the pantry. Thomas found himself looking forward to returning to the house each evening, where lamplight glowed through curtained windows, and the smell of home-cooked meals welcomed him. They learned each other's habits and preferences. Thomas discovered that Grace sang softly to herself while working, old hymns and folk songs in a clear, sweet voice. Grace learned that Thomas was a voracious reader who'd amassed a surprising library of classics, history, and practical manuals. Each day brought new revelations. Thomas showed Grace how to collect eggs without upsetting the hens, how to milk the placid cow, how to tell when tomatoes were ready for picking. Grace taught Thomas how to darn his socks properly, how to remove stains from linen, how a small bunch of wildflowers could transform a dinner table. They spoke of their pasts in measured doses. Thomas told her about coming west after losing his parents, working as a ranch hand until he could file his homestead claim. Grace shared stories of growing up in Philadelphia, her father's carpentry shop, her mother's lessons in needlework. But there were shadows neither had illuminated. Thomas rarely mentioned the war that had taken his parents. Grace avoided details about the final difficult months in Philadelphia after her parents' deaths. On a particularly hot afternoon, Thomas found Grace at the creek that ran behind the house, her skirts hitched up as she stood ankle-deep in the cool water, washing clothes on a smooth stone. "You don't need to do laundry in this heat," he said, concerned by her flushed cheeks. "The shirts needed washing," she replied, wiping her brow with the back of her hand. "And the creek is cooler than the house." Thomas sat on the bank, removing his hat. "You've transformed this place in just 2 weeks. I hardly recognize my own home." Grace looked up, suddenly uncertain. "Have I overstepped? I didn't think—" "No," he interrupted quickly. "That's not what I meant. You've made it better, made it a real home." He cleared his throat. "What I'm trying to say, poorly, is that I'm glad you're here." The simple declaration warmed her more than the summer sun. "I'm glad too." That evening after supper, they sat on the porch watching fireflies rise from the grass as darkness settled over the land. The air was still warm, heavy with the scent of grass and distant rain. "Storm coming," Thomas observed, nodding toward distant lightning illuminating clouds on the horizon. "We need the rain." Grace inhaled deeply, savoring the electric anticipation in the air. "I've always loved storms. My father used to say they clean the world and make it new again." Thomas turned to study her profile in the fading light. "Your father sounds like a wise man." "He was." Grief flickered across her face. "He built beautiful furniture pieces meant to last generations. After the war, when so many men returned missing limbs, he designed special chairs, tables they could use easily." Her voice softened with pride. "People came from 3 states to commission his work." "What happened?" Thomas asked gently. Grace stared at the approaching storm. "The influenza took both my parents within a week of each other last winter. Then the bank foreclosed on the shop." Her hands twisted in her lap. "I tried to keep it going, but no one wanted to buy furniture from a woman, no matter that I'd helped my father build every piece for years." Thomas was silent for a long moment. "My parents died at Gettysburg. Not in the battle, they ran a boarding house near the field hospital. When disease spread through the wounded, they caught it too." Grace's hand found his in the darkness, her fingers cool against his palm. "I was 15, he continued. "Too young to enlist, too old to be adopted. Worked odd jobs until I could head west, never looked back." "Until you decided you needed a wife," Grace said softly. Thomas's thumb traced circles on her hand. "Until I realized I was tired of being alone." The first fat raindrops began to fall, pattering on the porch roof. Neither moved to go inside, content to watch the storms approach together, their hands still joined. The next morning brought clear skies and catastrophe. Grace was gathering eggs when she heard Thomas shout from the barn. She ran toward the sound, nearly colliding with him as he emerged, face grim. "Someone's cut the fence on the north pasture," he said tersely. "At least 20 head of cattle are missing." "Rustlers?" Grace asked, her stomach clenching with fear. Thomas nodded grimly. "I need to alert the neighbors, get a tracking party together. They can't have gone far after last night's rain." "What should I do?" Grace asked, already mentally preparing for his absence. Thomas's eyes softened momentarily despite his anger. "Keep the rifle by you." "Bar the doors tonight if I'm not back." He hesitated. "And pray we find them before they cross into the territory. Sheriff has no jurisdiction there." Within an hour, 4 neighboring ranchers had arrived, grim-faced men with rifles and determination. They spoke in low voices with Thomas, studying tracks, planning their pursuit. The oldest of them, a weather-beaten man named Harlan, approached Grace as she brought canteens of water for their journey. "So you're Thomas's mail-order bride," he said, sizing her up with shrewd eyes. Grace lifted her chin. "I am Grace Zimmerman, yes." A smile cracked his leathery face. "Got spirit, I see. Good. Boy needs someone with backbone." He leaned closer. "Thomas is the best of us, miss. Honest to a fault. Some folks try to take advantage of that. You think the rustling wasn't random?" Grace asked, suddenly alert. Harlan shrugged. "4th time cattle have gone missing in the county this month, always from decent folks who can't afford the loss." He glanced toward the house. "You know how to use that rifle he mentioned?" "I've never fired a gun in my life," Grace admitted. Harlan's expression darkened. "Then bar those doors tight tonight, Miss Zimmerman, and if anyone comes knocking who ain't Thomas or one of us, you stay quiet as a church mouse." Fear settled cold in her stomach as she watched the men ride out, Thomas turning once to raise his hand in farewell. The ranch suddenly seemed very empty, very vulnerable. Grace spent the day in anxious productivity, baking bread, mending shirts, anything to keep her hands busy and her mind from imagining Thomas facing armed rustlers. As sunset approached with no sign of the tracking party, she reluctantly began securing the house, checking windows, moving the rifle to keep it within reach. The sound of approaching hoofbeats sent her heart racing until she realized it was a single rider, not the returning party. She positioned herself near the window, rifle awkwardly braced against her shoulder as her father had once shown her with his hunting gun. A familiar figure came into view: Carson Miller, the newspaper editor from town who had altered Thomas's advertisement. Relief mingled with suspicion as she lowered the gun. "What was he doing here, miles from town at dusk, Miss Zimmerman?" he called, dismounting. "Is Thomas about? I've news from town." Grace cracked the door, keeping the rifle visible. "He's gone after rustlers who took cattle last night." "What news brings you out so late, Mr. Miller?" Something flickered in Carson's eyes, surprise, perhaps frustration. "Rustlers, you say? That's actually why I've come. Sheriff received word a gang might be operating in the area." He stepped forward. "Perhaps I should come in, explain properly." Grace's grip tightened on the rifle, remembering Harlan's warning and Thomas's instruction to bar the doors. "I think it best if you relay any message to Thomas directly when he returns. I expect him soon." Carson's pleasant expression hardened. "It's not safe for a woman alone out here." "Thomas would want me to stay until he returns." "Mr. Xavier left clear instructions," Grace replied firmly. "I appreciate your concern, but I must follow my future husband's wishes." Carson's mouth twisted. "Future husband, my dear girl, has Thomas not told you? The ranch is mortgaged to its limit. He sought a wealthy bride because he's 3 months from foreclosure." The words landed like blows, but Grace kept her expression neutral. "Good night, Mr. Miller. I'll tell Thomas you called." She closed the door before he could respond, shooting the heavy bar into place with shaking hands. Through the window, she watched him mount his horse and ride away, his rigid posture betraying his anger. Was it true? Was Thomas in financial trouble? It would explain the altered advertisement. But why continue with their arrangement once he knew she had no money? And why would Carson ride miles to deliver this news at nightfall? Doubt crept in like a fog as the hours passed. Every creak of the settling house, every rustle of wind made her start. The rifle remained by her side, a cold comfort she prayed she wouldn't need to use. It was well past midnight when she heard horses approaching, multiple riders this time. She positioned herself by the window, heart pounding, until Thomas's voice called out, "Grace, it's me." She unbarred the door with trembling hands. Thomas stood on the porch, mud-splattered and exhausted but unharmed. Behind him, the other ranchers sat slumped in their saddles, equally weary. "You recovered the cattle?" she asked, relief making her voice unsteady. Thomas nodded. "Caught them at Miller's Creek, driving the herd toward the territorial line." His expression was grim. "2 men got away. We brought 3 back for the sheriff." Grace pulled him inside, suddenly desperate to have him home and safe. As the other ranchers departed with promises to return tomorrow, she heated water for washing and set out food from the supper she'd prepared hours earlier. Thomas ate ravenously, the day's exertion having left him famished. Only when he'd finished did Grace mention Carson's visit. "What did he want?" Thomas asked sharply. "He claimed to have news about rustlers," Grace said, watching his reaction carefully. "But he seemed surprised when I mentioned you were already pursuing some." Thomas's expression darkened. "Carson's never ridden out here after dark in the 8 years I've known him." He also said, Grace hesitated. "He said the ranch is mortgaged, that you're facing foreclosure. That's why you wanted a wealthy bride." Thomas set down his cup with enough force that coffee sloshed over the rim. "That lying," he cut himself off, visibly collecting himself. "Grace, look at me." She met his gaze steadily. "This ranch is paid for free and clear. I've never mortgaged a single acre." His voice was intense with controlled anger. "Carson's been trying to get me to sell to Eastern investors for 2 years. When I refused, he's apparently decided to try other tactics." Relief washed through her. "I didn't believe him, but I didn't understand why he would say such things." Thomas ran a hand through his hair in frustration. "Carson's got himself involved with men who want to buy up small ranches, combine them into one massive operation. He gets a commission for each property he helps acquire." His mouth set in a grim line. "When I wouldn't sell, he decided a wealthy wife might convince me to move back east. Hence the altered advertisement. And when I arrived with no money," Grace began, "he likely figured I'd send you packing." Thomas reached across the table for her hand. "Grace, I meant what I said that first day. Gold don't buy what you bring to this ranch, to my life." His words warmed her, but confusion remained. "But what does this have to do with the rustlers?" Thomas's expression hardened. "I'm beginning to think these thefts aren't random. Every rancher hit has refused to sell." He squeezed her hand. I need to speak with Sheriff Parker tomorrow. In the meantime, I don't want you alone out here. I'm not afraid, Grace protested. I know you're not, Thomas said with a faint smile, but I am, for you. The simple admission revealed more of his feelings than any declaration might have. Grace accompanied Thomas to town the next morning. Pine Ridge was busier than her initial arrival, with wagons lining the main street and people moving purposefully between businesses. The general store, saloon, and blacksmith shop formed the heart of the small community, with smaller establishments including Carson's newspaper office filling the gaps. Sheriff Parker listened to Thomas's suspicions with growing concern. You're suggesting Carson Miller, respected newspaper editor, is involved with rustling. I'm saying it's mighty coincidental that only ranchers who have refused to sell have been targeted, Thomas replied. And Carson's visit to my ranch last night, alone after dark, raises questions. The sheriff rubbed his jaw thoughtfully. The men you brought in haven't talked yet. I'll see what I can get out of them. He glanced at Grace. Miss Zimmerman, it's good to see you settling in. Town's been buzzing with news of Thomas finally finding himself a bride. Grace smiled politely, though she'd already noticed the curious stares from townspeople. She wondered how many had read Carson's altered advertisement and expected Thomas to return with a wealthy Eastern lady rather than a penniless seamstress. While Thomas continued his discussion with the sheriff, Grace excused herself to visit the general store for supplies. The proprietor's wife, Mrs. Hendricks, greeted her warmly. So you're Thomas Xavier's mail-order bride. We've all been wondering when he'd bring you to town. The plump woman beamed. Such a fine man, half the unmarried women hereabouts were heartbroken when they heard he'd sent away for a wife. Grace smiled, selecting coffee and sugar. We're still becoming acquainted, but yes, I've agreed to marry him, Mrs. Hendricks lowered her voice conspiratorially. I hear you're quite the catch yourself, daughter of Eastern money, they say. Grace stiffened. I'm afraid whoever told you that was mistaken. My father was a carpenter and a fine one, but we were never wealthy. Confusion crossed the older woman's face. But Carson Miller said. She stopped abruptly as the store's door opened. Carson himself stood in the doorway, his expression shifting from surprise to calculation upon seeing Grace. Miss Zimmerman, recovered from your fright last night, I see. Mr. Miller, Grace nodded coolly. Thomas and I were just speaking with Sheriff Parker about your unexpected visit. Something flickered in Carson's eyes. Merely neighborly concern, I assure you, he approached, lowering his voice. Have you spoken with Thomas about what I told you? The ranch's financial troubles. There was nothing to discuss, Grace replied evenly. Thomas has no mortgage, no financial difficulties, which you well know. Carson's friendly mask slipped. My dear girl, you don't understand the opportunities you're both missing. The investors I represent would pay handsomely for Xavier land. You could return east in style, not live out your days in wilderness isolation. I came west by choice, Mr. Miller. I have no desire to return east, even when winter comes. When you're snowed in for weeks with nothing but howling wind and a man who barely speaks, Carson pressed. This isn't a life for someone raised in civilization, Miss Zimmerman. I believe I'll determine what life suits me, Grace replied, her voice firm despite her racing heart. Now if you'll excuse me, I need to finish my shopping. Carson caught her arm as she turned away, his fingers digging into her flesh. You should reconsider. Accidents happen on isolated ranches. Thomas would be devastated if something happened to his bride-to-be. The threat, thinly veiled, sent ice through her veins. Before she could respond, a shadow fell across them. Take your hand off her. Thomas's voice was dangerously soft, his stance rigid in the doorway. Carson released her immediately, pasting on a smile, just steadying the lady. These floors can be treacherous. Thomas moved to Grace's side, his hand coming to rest protectively at the small of her back. We're leaving now, he said to her, never taking his eyes off Carson. Outside, Thomas examined her arm where Carson had gripped it. Did he hurt you? No, Grace assured him, though the skin was already reddening. But he threatened me, warned that accidents happen on isolated ranches. Thomas's expression hardened into something that might have frightened her had it been directed at her. I'll speak with Sheriff Parker again. He won't have proof, Grace said pragmatically. It will be my word against Carson's. Then we'll find proof, Thomas insisted. I won't have you threatened in broad daylight and do nothing. They collected their supplies and headed back to the ranch, both preoccupied with the confrontation. As they crested the final hill overlooking the homestead, Thomas reined in sharply. Smoke rose from where the barn should be. "Stay here," he commanded, urging his horse forward. Grace ignored the instruction, keeping pace beside him. They galloped into the yard to find the barn engulfed in flames, the heat intense even from a distance. Thomas leapt from his horse, racing toward the structure. "The animals," Grace cried, following him. Thomas already had the barn doors open, rushing inside despite the smoke and heat. Grace grabbed buckets, organizing a futile water line from the nearby pump. Knowing it was already too late to save the structure but desperate to help, minutes stretched like hours before Thomas emerged, leading Penny and Buck, coughing violently. 3 cows followed, but the chickens and 2 other horses were lost to the blaze. Neighbors began arriving, alerted by the smoke visible for miles. They formed a bucket line, fighting to keep the fire from spreading to the house or the nearby hay storage. By nightfall, the barn was a smoldering ruin. Thomas, face streaked with soot and eyes red from smoke, stood staring at the destruction, his posture one of exhausted rage. Grace brought him water, gently insisting he drink. "This was deliberate," she said quietly. "Carson's threat, then this. It's too coincidental. Sheriff's riding out at first light," Thomas replied, his voice rough from smoke, "but unless we find whoever said it." He didn't need to finish the thought. That night they sat at the kitchen table, doors locked, rifle within reach. The loss of the barn was a serious blow, not just the structure, but the stored grain, tools, and animals. "What happens now?" Grace asked softly. Thomas looked up from cleaning his gun, his face haggard in the lamplight. "We rebuild, but first we find who did this. And if it was Carson, then he'll face justice." Thomas set the rifle aside. "Grace, I would understand if you wanted to return east. This isn't what you agreed to when you came here." Grace reached across the table, taking his roughened hand in hers. "I came west for a new beginning, Thomas, with you." Her voice strengthened. "I won't be frightened away." Something shifted in Thomas's expression, a softening, a wonder. "You are the strongest woman I've ever known, Grace Zimmerman. Strong enough to help rebuild a barn," she said with a small smile. Thomas's hand turned in hers, their fingers interlacing. "We'll start tomorrow." The next week brought a flurry of activity. Neighbors arrived with lumber, tools, and willing hands. The barn raising became a community event, with women bringing food while men worked from dawn till dusk. Grace moved among them, serving meals, carrying water, and occasionally holding boards in place when an extra pair of hands was needed. Sheriff Parker investigated the fire, but found little evidence beyond boot prints that could have belonged to anyone. The men captured during the cattle rustling still refused to talk. Though they would stand trial for their crimes, throughout it all, Thomas worked tirelessly, speaking little but accomplishing much. Grace watched him direct the rebuilding efforts with quiet authority, earning the respect of men twice his age. In the evenings, though exhausted, he would sit with her on the porch, discussing the day and planning for tomorrow. One evening, as the new barn neared completion, Thomas broached the subject they'd been circling for weeks. "The circuit preacher comes through next Sunday," he said, staring out at the darkening land. "If you're still willing, we could be married then." Grace's heart quickened. "Are you certain?" With everything that's happened, Thomas turned to her, moonlight silvering his features. "I've never been more certain of anything. These past weeks, seeing your courage, your determination, I know I want you by my side for whatever comes." He reached into his pocket, producing a small wooden box. "I've been carrying this for days, waiting for the right moment." Inside was a ring, a simple gold band set with a small pearl, nothing ostentatious but beautiful in its simplicity. "It was my mother's," Thomas explained. "I've kept it all these years, waiting for someone worthy to wear it." Tears pricked Grace's eyes as he slipped it onto her finger. "It's perfect," she whispered. Thomas's hand came up to cup her cheek. "May I kiss you, Grace Zimmerman? I've wanted to since the day you arrived." In answer, she leaned forward, meeting his lips with hers. The kiss was gentle at first, then deepened as his arms encircled her, drawing her closer. When they finally parted, both breathless, Thomas rested his forehead against hers. "I never expected to find love from a newspaper advertisement," he murmured. "Nor I," Grace replied, her hands resting against his chest, feeling the strong beat of his heart. "But I'm grateful every day that I did." Their wedding plans spread quickly through the community, bringing a welcome distraction from the troubles of recent weeks. Women from neighboring ranches visited, bringing wedding gifts and offers to help with preparations. Even Mrs. Hendricks from the general store rode out, bringing fabric for a proper wedding dress when she learned Grace planned to marry in her best Sunday dress. "Every bride deserves something special," the older woman insisted, pressing the pale blue material into Grace's hands. "This will bring out your eyes something wonderful." Grace worked on the dress in the evenings, creating a simple but elegant design that suited both the occasion and her practical nature. Thomas watched her sew by lamplight, marveling at the speed and precision of her fingers. "You really could open a dressmaking shop in town," he observed one night. "If you wanted to." Grace looked up, needle paused mid-stitch. "Would you mind if I worked outside the home, mind?" Thomas seemed genuinely puzzled. "Grace, I want you to be happy here. If making dresses would bring you satisfaction, I'd build you a shop myself." Her heart warmed at his support. "Perhaps someday. For now, I'm content learning to be a rancher's wife," she smiled. "Though I might make curtains for half the county if they'll pay in butter and eggs." Thomas laughed, the sound still rare enough to delight her. "I suspect they'd consider it a bargain." The Sunday before their wedding, they attended church in town, a simple building that served as schoolhouse during the week. Grace felt the stares of the congregation, some curious, some welcoming, a few disapproving. Carson Miller sat in a front pew, his back rigidly straight when they entered. The preacher, a circuit rider who visited monthly, delivered a sermon on perseverance through hardship that seemed particularly apt. Afterward, community members gathered outside, congratulating the couple on their upcoming nuptials. As they prepared to leave, Sheriff Parker approached, his expression troubled. "Thomas, Miss Zimmerman, might I have a word?" They stepped aside, and the sheriff lowered his voice. One of the rustlers finally talked. "Says they were hired by someone in town, paid to target specific ranches that refused to sell." Thomas's hand tightened on Grace's arm. "Carson Miller." "He didn't name names," Parker replied, "but he mentioned a newspaper. I'm getting a warrant to search Miller's office tomorrow." "Be careful," Grace warned. "He's desperate. The fire proves how far he's willing to go." The sheriff nodded grimly. "I've deputized extra men. We'll handle this proper and legal." As they rode home, Thomas was unusually quiet, his brow furrowed in thought. "I don't like leaving you alone tomorrow," he finally said, "but I need to be in town when they search Miller's office." "I'll be fine," Grace assured him. "The new barn is almost finished, the house is secure, and I know how to use the rifle now." Harlan had insisted on teaching her after the fire, drilling her until she could hit a can at 20 paces. Thomas still looked troubled. "Promise me you'll stay alert. Don't open the door for anyone but our neighbors." "I promise," Grace said solemnly. The next morning dawned clear and cool, a perfect late summer day. Thomas left at first light, promising to return by nightfall. Grace kept busy with wedding preparations and household chores, the rifle never far from reach, despite her reassurances to Thomas. Midday brought the sound of approaching horses. Grace moved to the window, rifle ready, relaxing only when she recognized Harlan's weathered form leading two other neighbors. "Miss Grace," Harlan called as she opened the door. "Thomas asked us to check on you. We're helping raise the last barn wall, if that's agreeable." "Very agreeable," Grace replied with relief. "I've just made fresh lemonade." The men worked through the afternoon, completing the main structure of the new barn. Grace provided food and drink, grateful for their presence and the progress on the rebuilding. As evening approached, Harlan glanced at the setting sun. "We'd best head back before dark. Will you be all right until Thomas returns?" "Of course," Grace assured him. "Thank you for your help today." She watched them ride away, then secured the house for the night, lighting lamps as darkness fell. Thomas had promised to return, but as hours passed with no sign of him, worry began to gnaw at her. When hoofbeats finally sounded in the yard, Grace rushed to the window, relief flooding her. But it wasn't Thomas who dismounted, it was Carson Miller, and he wasn't alone. Two rough-looking men accompanied him, one carrying a torch. Grace's heart hammered against her ribs. She checked the rifle, making sure it was loaded, then positioned herself where she could see the yard but remain hidden from view. "Miss Zimmerman," Carson called, his voice carrying in the night air. "I know you're alone. Thomas won't be coming back tonight. He's had a most unfortunate accident in town." Fear clutched at her throat, but Grace forced herself to remain calm. Carson was trying to lure her out. "The sheriff is holding him on suspicion of fraud," Carson continued when she didn't respond. "Seems he's been taking money from Eastern investors, claiming to sell land he doesn't own." Grace remained silent, watching as the men spread out, approaching the house from different angles. "All I want is the deed to the property," Carson called. "Bring it out and you can go free. I'll even provide passage back east." One of the men reached the porch, testing the door. Finding it locked, he moved to a window, peering inside. The other circled toward the back of the house. Grace took a steadying breath, raised the rifle, and fired through the window near the man on the porch. The glass shattered and the man fell back with a yell, clutching his arm. "The next one won't miss," Grace shouted. "Get off this property now." Carson's face contorted with rage. "Burn it," he ordered the man with the torch. "Burn it all." The man hesitated. "There's a woman in there, Miller." "Do it," Carson snarled. "We'll say it was an accident. No one will question it after the barn." The second man emerged from behind the house. "She's alone. Xavier's nowhere around." Grace fired again, the bullet splintering wood near Carson's head. "I've got 6 more shots," she called steadily. "And I won't miss again." The wounded man scrambled back toward the horses. "This ain't worth dying for, Miller. You didn't say nothing about killing women." Carson pulled a pistol from his coat. "I'll do it myself, then." The crack of another rifle not Grace's split the night. Carson cried out, dropping his gun as blood blossomed on his shoulder. The 2 men with him fled immediately, disappearing into the darkness. "Grace." Thomas's voice came from the darkness beyond the yard. "Are you hurt?" "I'm fine," she called back, relief making her knees weak. Thomas emerged from the shadows, rifle raised, moving cautiously toward Carson, who knelt clutching his wounded shoulder. Sheriff Parker and 2 deputies followed, their own weapons trained on the newspaper editor. "Carson Miller, you're under arrest for attempted murder, arson, and conspiracy to commit theft," Parker announced, hauling the wounded man to his feet. Grace flung open the door, rushing down the steps and into Thomas's waiting arms. He held her tightly, his heart pounding against hers. "I thought when he said you'd had an accident," she couldn't complete the sentence, her throat tight with emotion. "We found evidence in his office," Thomas explained, stroking her hair. "Letters to Eastern investors, plans for the combined ranches. When we went to arrest him, he'd already fled." His arms tightened around her. "I knew he'd come here." Sheriff Parker approached, Carson now securely handcuffed despite his wound. "Miss Zimmerman, that was some fine shooting. Winged him clean through the arm without killing him." "I was aiming for his heart," Grace admitted, only half joking. Thomas chuckled, the sound rumbling through his chest against her ear. "Remind me never to cross you, future Mrs. Xavier." The following Sunday, Grace stood beside Thomas before the community, exchanging vows that seemed all the more meaningful after the trials they'd endured together. Her blue dress, carefully sewn by her own hands, caught the light filtering through the church's simple glass windows. Thomas wore a new shirt and his best trousers, his hair freshly cut and face clean-shaven. "Do you, Thomas Xavier, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" The circuit preacher asked. Thomas's eyes, warm as summer skies, never left Grace's face. "I do." "And do you, Grace Zimmerman, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" "I do," Grace replied, her voice clear and certain. "Then by the authority vested in me, I pronounce you husband and wife." The preacher smiled. "You may kiss your bride." Thomas's kiss was gentle but filled with promise, his hands cupping her face as if she were the most precious thing he'd ever held. When they turned to face the congregation as Mr. and Mrs. Xavier, the community erupted in cheers and applause. The celebration continued at the ranch, where neighbors had prepared a feast in the newly completed barn. Lanterns hung from rafters, tables groaned with food, and a fiddler played lively tunes for dancing. Carson Miller awaited trial in the territorial prison, his schemes exposed and his conspirators captured or fled. As evening fell, Thomas led Grace away from the festivities, up to the small rise where they'd shared their first picnic overlooking the ranch. "I have a wedding gift for you," he said, producing a folded document from his pocket. "I had this drawn up in town last week." Grace unfolded it, reading by the light of the full moon. "A deed, half the ranch in your name," Thomas explained. "We're equal partners now in every way." Tears filled Grace's eyes. "Thomas, you didn't have to, I wanted to," he interrupted gently. "What's mine is yours, what's yours is mine. That's what marriage means to me." Grace tucked the deed away and wrapped her arms around his neck. "Do you know what today is? Besides our wedding day," Thomas shook his head, puzzled. "It's exactly 1 month since I arrived on that stagecoach, terrified you'd send me away when you discovered I had no money." She smiled up at him. "Instead, you told me gold don't buy what I bring." "The truest words I've ever spoken," Thomas murmured, drawing her closer. "Your courage, your heart, those are worth more than all the gold in Wyoming Territory." "I love you, Thomas Xavier," Grace said simply. "And I love you, Grace Xavier," he replied, the name sounding right and perfect on his lips. "Welcome home." In the years that followed, their love only deepened as they faced the challenges of ranch life together. Grace opened a small dressmaking shop in town that quickly became known throughout the territory for quality work. Thomas expanded the ranch, eventually becoming one of the most respected cattlemen in Wyoming. They had 3 children, 2 sons, and a daughter who grew up strong and capable under their parents' loving guidance. And on quiet evenings, Thomas and Grace would sit on their porch, watching the sunset paint the vast Wyoming sky, their hands still finding each other as naturally as breathing. Sometimes, Grace would recall that first day, when she'd arrived with nothing but hope and determination, expecting rejection but finding love instead. And Thomas would remind her, with a kiss and a smile, that some treasures couldn't be measured in gold, only in the wealth of a shared life, built together day by day, through every storm and sunshine.